My main thing that I do here at Alta Mira, my job here is to do the assessments of our clients. And basically, since I started graduate school, I've been so fascinated with assessment. I really love testing. It's my favorite thing. And all of the other students in class thought I was crazy because they love therapy. And what I love about assessment is that it's kind of like a mystery. You know, every client that comes in is this kind of fascinating mystery to me, that with the assessment tools, we really find out what is going on with them and why they have been using and why they are addicted. Of course, there's almost every person has a genetic component, but in addition to the genetic component, there's also many other factors. And in the testing, we figure those out, and we try to finish the testing by the 18th day that people are here. And so that gives us, people stay for 35 days generally, if not more. That's usually the minimum is 35 days. So with 18 days, we have about 17 more days to work with them with the knowledge that we have by the testing. But as we go through the testing, even from the second or third day that they're here, if they have already detoxed, many people do come in already detoxed. The people that haven't already detoxed, of course, we do wait until, you know, they're feeling much better. You know, otherwise the testing wouldn't be valid. But as we go through the testing, we do have meetings every day at what we call pass down, and so I will give information every day as the testing proceeds along. And then when we finally finish the testing, I sit down with the client and give feedback. So what I wanted to talk about today was post-traumatic stress disorder, and I wanted to talk about trauma, and I wanted actually to talk about some different kinds of trauma, and one specific different kinds of trauma that not everyone is aware of, and a couple new ideas. And I would really love people's feedback when I finished, talking, and we go into the question period. So we can go to the next slide. There are two main kinds of trauma that we see in our clients here, and that exist among everybody. And when bad things happen, everybody knows about that kind of trauma. Of course, that kind of trauma includes, we'll go into those kind of traumas, but it includes, of course, being a veteran, fighting, war, rape, abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, all the kind of traumas that we're used to and know so much about. But there's another kind of trauma that people aren't so aware of that I did want to bring up also. When good things happen. And I know that sounds counter-logical, that it doesn't seem to make sense at first. What are you talking about when good things happen? It's great when good things happen. But if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll first talk about the regular traumas. These are the ones that everybody's familiar with. Serious accidents, fire, explosion, natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, the floods that just happened on the East Coast. And the next one is physical assault by a family member or someone that you know. The next is physical assault by a stranger. The next is a sexual assault by a family member or somebody that you know. Sexual assault by a stranger. And then we have military combat and war zone, sexual contact when you're young with someone who's 5 or more years older, even if it's consensual, imprisonment, torture, life-threatening illness, and then all the other traumas. These are the kind of traumas that we're all familiar with and that we know about and that we see so often, and that when people come here to the Alta Mira, as well as many cases that I've worked on in court outside of here, these are the kind of traumas that usually come up and are usually very evident and obvious. And so, if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So one thing I did want to bring up, which is kind of an unusual idea, but what I have seen this more and more often as I've been aware of it and have been looking for it. There are a second kind of traumas that are what I call the good traumas. And these kind of traumas are things like getting your dream job, falling in love, getting married, having a baby, moving to a wonderful place, a big career success, winning an award, getting a new pet. That's a border terrier. That's like a picture. That's my dog, actually. Graduating from college and buying your first home. The reason I wanted to bring these up, and I think that these are so important with all of our clients, as well as with ourselves, as well as with many of the cases that I do. And it doesn't seem obvious at first. It doesn't seem logical. And it's like what we should, I wanted to make people aware of these kind of things so that when you are working with people who come to you who have had trauma, and we do work with so many people that had very serious trauma of the kind that we just spoke about before. It's a very good thing to be aware of what I call the good traumas also. Because what will happen, and what I have seen happen over the last number of years, is there have been very interesting cases where something very good happens in someone's life, and where all of a sudden, this happened at Tamalpais High School, actually, about 2 years ago. There were 4 suicides in a row, and I was involved in some of those cases. And it was in the newspaper, and what they said in the newspaper was, for the first suicide, they didn't understand why this boy had committed suicide. It didn't make any sense. He was very handsome. He had tons of friends. Everything was going so well for him. And then when we looked further into what had actually happened, he had a tremendous recent success. And so those kind of things can cause a temporary loss of reality testing and what I call magical thinking. And then you can get into a lot of trouble with that. And this doesn't, of course, happen with everybody. We all have these kind of successes. And when we have these things happen, we don't, lose control. But with certain people who are very sensitive, who are very intelligent, who get very affected by things, sometimes when they have great successes, these kind of things can happen where they lose reality testing. If we go to the next slide. And the question is why? Why do these things happen where when somebody has a great success, they can all of a sudden do something that seems very, very self-destructive, and it doesn't seem to make sense. Just for instance, if people, there was a certain movie star about 8 years ago that had his first major movie come out, and he became tremendously famous basically overnight. And the next day he was caught under a huge advertisement for his film with a prostitute in a car, and so had to go to jail for a short time. And so it was like, why on earth did he do that? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And you'll see a lot of this kind of self-destructive behavior happening right after someone has had a tremendous success. And it's like, how could that possibly be traumatic? How could that make any sense at all? But what does happen in these kind of cases is that when somebody has a tremendous success, just say, for instance, I remember myself when I had finished graduate school and I had applied to St. Mary's Medical Center, where I've been for about 18 years, actually, now. I still work there a little bit. And it was supposed to be one of the best places in the state to get training. And I got a call in the morning that I had gotten the job. And I was driving over the Bay Bridge right after that, and all of a sudden, I almost felt like I was out of my body. I felt like things weren't real. Did I really get that phone call? Aside from the fact that I thought I was going completely crazy, and it was like, am I going completely nuts? What it was one of these kind of situations where when something really wonderful happens, and that includes, by the way, falling in love. Falling in love can be very dangerous, as Shakespeare can tell us. The defenses get overwhelmed, and this is, by the way, of course, for a short temporary period of time. There's a lack of repression. There's magical thinking. And I'm sure everyone in the room has had a time when they have something wonderful happen. And for even a few moments, they might feel kind of on top of the world. And they kind of feel very special. And they feel magical. And then you get into this trouble with reality testing. And so, again, for most people, they can have successes, and go on. Nothing will happen. But it's a good thing to be aware of this with certain clients, because people can come to you and tell you about their lives. And if you kind of root around a little bit, you will find out that they may have just had a really great success. And of course, there can also have been some traumas that they've experienced. But it's a good idea to be aware of the successes as well as the traumas, because when somebody has something wonderful happen, what happens at that moment is then they feel special and magical and kind of on top of the world. And then what happens is, for that moment, they lose reality testing. And it's very hard to tell what's real and what's not real because they feel magical. There was a wonderful film called Man on Wire. I don't know if people have seen that. And it was an incredible film about a fellow who was a high wire walker. And that's all he wanted to do his whole life, was walk on high wires. But his great, great goal was to walk between the World Trade Twin Towers this was before, of course, 9/11. And so he worked his whole life very, very hard, and he actually did that. Of course, it was illegal. And so the movie was about all of the planning that he did to string a wire between the Twin Towers, and he actually walked between the Twin Towers. And if people remember this, it was about, I think it was 1999 or 2000, and he walked between the towers, and he stayed up there for about an hour. It was completely illegal, but of course every media outlet in the world was there watching him, and he was drifting back and forth. It looked incredibly magical and fantastic, and it looked superhuman. And he had these, I imagine, unbelievable feelings of success. And after an hour of walking back and forth and almost dancing back and forth on the wire, he came down from the wire. And then what happened was very interesting. He had had a very serious girlfriend for many, many years. But when he came down off the wire, he did not go to the girlfriend. He picked a girl out of the crowd and went off to a hotel for about 4 days with her, somebody he didn't know at all. And then after that, completely disintegrated and fell completely to pieces. He has never actually recovered. And he now lives in a 5th floor, what we call cold water walk-up flat in Paris, making his meals on little hot plate. It's very tragic. And so this happened immediately after a tremendous success. And then also, if people remember Bobby Fischer, the chess champion, he was asked to play against Boris Spassky in Reykjavik in Iceland. And so he played this world championship. First of all, he refused to go. And so he sat in his hotel room for days, and the President of the United States begged him to go, so on and so forth. He finally went. He won. And if people remember what happened immediately after he won the world championship with Boris Spassky, he went completely to pieces. He had a complete nervous breakdown. He wound up in Los Angeles. He wound up with the Hare Krishnas. He kind of disappeared for about 10 years. And then he came back again. He was found again. He was rematched with Spassky in Yugoslavia. He went back there. He won again, and again went completely to pieces, and wound up disappearing into the forest for a while and going completely disintegrating. So those are kind of extreme situations. Another situation is with Albert Einstein, actually. When Einstein arrived at his theories of relativity, he had the specific theory of relativity, and then he had a general theory of relativity. And when he did the general theory of relativity, which at that time that he published it, he was the most famous person in the world, and he went completely to pieces after that. He divorced his wife, who he loved very much. He married the housekeeper. He completely disintegrated, and from then on, never recovered. And so those are just a few examples of what can happen with tremendous success. Those are extreme cases, but it's just a good thing to be aware of. So now, actually, thanks, Christy, I want to talk about the testing that we do here and how being aware of both kind of traumas is really helpful in the work that we do. So when we get clients in here, often we will, one of the very first things we do in testing is do the interview. And that's very important. And, I ask all about their childhood and where did they grow up. And can they tell me also when did they start drinking or using drugs? And how long have they done that? And do they remember anything that kind of really tipped them off? Like when did they start, when did things get out of control, basically? And so I would say out of all the clients that we have, I think every single one of them has had traumas, without a doubt. Out of the people who've had traumas, probably about 30 to 40% do have post-traumatic stress disorder, as it is in the DSM-4, meaning that they have the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They have the 3 different categories, which means that they have, first of all, what we call avoidance. They want to avoid the places, the people, the things that remind them of the trauma. Then they also have the kind of symptoms where they can't sleep, they can't concentrate, and then they have these thoughts that come to them. They have nightmares. They feel that they're reliving the trauma. They have flashbacks. The standard post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So when we find in our clients that they have the post-traumatic stress disorder, then we look to the treatment and then what the future looks like for them. And in order to diagnose the post-traumatic stress disorder, we do with each client a full battery, which includes cognitive testing and psychological testing. And in the psychological testing, we break it down to self-reports and projective testing. So, thanks. Again, I'm going to talk about 3 specific cases we have at Alta Mira, and of course, because of confidentiality, they will be not the exact cases, but kind of a melange of the cases. And so when we first meet a client, I will sit down with them and have an interview, and again, go through where they grew up and what their family structure is like, and why they came here, and when they started to feel like the drinking or the using was out of control, and how it's affected their life. And then we'll go into the testing procedure, and after we finish the testing, I'll write up the report, and then we'll do feedback. And so when we start with the testing, Thanks, Christy. And again, just to recap again with the good trauma, this is also what happens with bad traumas. Also, it's with all of the traumas. When I do the interview with the clients, I will be looking for times when they felt overwhelmed and times when they felt like they couldn't cope. And in the testing, we'll see results that will actually show times where they've had a lack of repression or magical thinking. The Rorschach is really good for that. And I'll ask them also not just about any traumas that they've had, but I'll also ask them about successes. And do they remember times when they had wonderful things happen? Because that is very important also for the reasons that I've just gone through. Because when they have had great successes, these things can happen. The lack of repression, the magical thinking, their defenses can get overwhelmed. It starts with the feeling of being on top of the world and kind of disintegrates into having reality testing problems. And so when we start on the actual testing, the first part of the tests that we do after the interview are the cognitive tests. And that's usually the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And the cognitive testing includes the 4 domains of cognitive ability, which is verbal ability, visual ability, working memory, which is auditory memory, and then processing speed. And then the second part of the testing will be the psychological testing, and that will be the projective testing and the self-report. The self-report measures that we use are the Beck Depression Inventory, the Beck Anxiety Inventory. We also use the PDS, which is the Post-Traumatic Stress Syndrome Checklist. We use the SCL90R, which is 90 different symptoms. It's kind of a symptom checklist that is really helpful to figure out if the person has post-traumatic stress disorder or not, along with the PDS. Those are the two very important ones for post-traumatic stress in the self-reports. Also in the self-reports, we'll do something called the adult self-report, which is like a miniature MMPI, and then we do the MMPI. And we do the second version of the MMPI. We do the full MMPI with 567 questions. And then we'll also then go into the projective testing, where we'll do the projective drawings. We'll do the thematic apperception test. We'll do the Rorschach, and we'll do the incomplete phrases. So, and then, in addition to all of that, depending on the client, we will sometimes do vocational personality testing. The personality is the Myers-Briggs, and the vocational is the Strong Interest Inventory. That is not really a part of the PTSD testing, but it is an important part of the testing, especially for young clients or for clients who are in the middle of a career change, and they would like to know what they are going to be doing next. They're not happy with their job. They want to change jobs. What kind of job would they be most happy at? What kind of career would they really enjoy? And so I will ask a client if they have any interest in taking a vocational test. And if they do, then we go ahead and do the Strong Interest Inventory, as well as the Myers-Briggs. And in the Myers-Briggs, there's different ways you can get it scored. And you can get it scored for work situation. And so to match the person the best with future different kinds of careers. So in my experience, and this is certainly not true with all recovery centers, but with many recovery centers that our clients have gone to previously, they've had excellent treatment. But when it comes to the testing and the assessment, very often we'll find that the testing that's usually done is smaller than the batteries that I've just described. And it will usually include the MMPI-2 and the BDI and the BAI, the Beck Depression Inventory and the Beck Anxiety Inventory, and sometimes the Myers-Briggs. Usually cognitive testing, meaning the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, is usually not included. We have had, there's certainly some different recovery centers that do full batteries, but usually they do contract out for those, and they usually don't do them, and they certainly usually do not do them with each client. And so we do try to do the full battery with each client, which is how we try to differentiate Alta from many of the other recovery centers in the country. And when we do the cognitive testing, which again, many places do not have the opportunity to do, but when we do the cognitive testing, the four main domains, and this, by the way, is very important for post-traumatic stress disorder diagnoses, because when I get into a case study that I'm about to get into, you'll see that there's an absolute standard profile on the Weiss that you see over and over again with post-traumatic stress disorder. The four domains are verbal comprehension, which has 3 subtests, similarities, vocabulary, and information. Then perceptual reasoning, which is the block design, matrix reasoning, and visual puzzles. The working memory, which is digit span, and arithmetic, and processing speed, which is coding and symbol search. And so the profile that you'll usually see with somebody who has post-traumatic stress disorder, I'll just talk about one of the cases now that we had here. And again, all of the facts have been changed to protect the person's confidentiality. But there was a woman that we had come in about 1.5 years ago, and she was from the East Coast, and she was absolutely brilliant. And she had come in and had very serious cocaine and alcohol abuse. And she was in a certain field where she was the top CEO of a worldwide corporation, and she was the very top person in the entire world. And she was responsible for, several $billion of business per year. And she came in, and it was so fascinating because she did have a traumatic childhood. She had had a lot of physical abuse. There hadn't been any sexual abuse, but there was a lot of physical abuse from her parents. And yet, she had recovered from that and recovered from extreme poverty. She had grown up in extreme poverty. And she recovered from that and went and became the CEO, the lead person of this multi-billion-dollar company. It was amazing to see her level of resilience. It was really impressive. And yet, what had brought her in here, what had brought her in here was over the previous 5 years, she had spiraled down into using cocaine and alcohol on a daily basis. And it had gotten to the point where she had been asked to step down from her job. Then she went to a rival company and was the CEO of that company for about 3 years. And then she was asked to step down from that company. And she, after coming here, recovered and is now back with the first company, which is really great news. But one of the baffling things about her was that there had been this trauma in childhood, which definitely affected her, but it seemed that the drinking started after her success. And so there's many different ways to look at that. And you can say, what is the reason? How did this happen? And you can say, well, because she grew up in terrible poverty and her sisters and brothers were very unsuccessful, that she felt terribly guilty. But then you can also look at the theory of the good trauma and that she had kind of fallen apart and lost some reality testing. And in order to come back to reality, started to use and be self-destructive to kind of get rid of the success, as it were, because it was so disturbing to have that feeling of being crazy or losing reality testing. So in her case, when we did the Wechsler, and this is absolutely the profile you'll see with people that have PTSD, she had extremely high verbal comprehension, like 99th percentile. The visual was also very high in the 90s, but the matrix reasoning, and there's actually no written reports, there's no written research about this, but I have seen this over and over and over again. What happens is there's a tremendous drop in matrix reasoning down to about 10th or 15th percentile. One of the reasons I think for that is that matrix reasoning is patterns, and they're very bright colored, and colors pull for affect and feeling. And so when the person is looking at this visual puzzle, as it were, and the colors are much brighter than in the other two subtests, they kind of fall apart a little bit. And because they have had trauma, the feelings and the emotions really get to them. And they can't do as well. They can't concentrate. They lose their concentration. So you'll see a tremendous dip in matrix reasoning. Then in working memory, usually the digit span forward, when I ask them to say numbers back to me, will be very high. But when I ask them to say numbers backwards, which is mental manipulation, and they have to hold the information in their mind and flip it and say it back, that will be extremely difficult for them. And so that will fall down. And then in processing speed, it will be a very low score also. So that's usually the profile you'll see with PTSD. Very high verbal comprehension, high visual with the one dip with matrix reasoning, lowered working memory, except for arithmetic will be okay. It will usually not be as affected, but the digit span will be affected. And then the processing speed, which is coding and symbol search, which means writing down symbols as fast as you can, that will be affected. Because of the depressive element of the post-traumatic stress disorder and the anxiety. And so, in other words, in the verbal comprehension part, the similarities, the vocabulary and the information will all be very high because these are pretty impervious to anxiety. And we can go to the next one, thanks. And then in the perceptual reasoning again, the block design will be high, the visual puzzles will be high, and there'll be a tremendous dip in matrix reasoning. And then in the next area, this is just a description of block design. You put together 4 to 9 blocks to match a 2-dimensional image, which looks something like this. These, of course, are not the real ones because they're copyright protected, but it looks something like this. It tests for visual spatial ability. It's sensitive to people with ADD or ADHD. We'll get kind of a lower score. but it isn't that sensitive to post-traumatic stress disorder. So those scores will usually be higher. And we can do the next one. Thanks, Christy. And then for matrix reasoning, this is a set of patterns that are missing a piece. The client looks at the pattern and chooses one of 5 possible pieces to complete the pattern, but the colors are very bright. And for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, you really will see a tremendous dip in this score every single time I've seen it. And then on the visual puzzles, that's the third part of the perceptual reasoning. You'll see, this is also a visual spatial test, but it is much more invulnerable to anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's just seen a design up at the top of the page with 6 pieces at the bottom, and you pick 3 out of those 6 to make the design up at the top. And then, so the psychological testing, which we do after the cognitive, is the Beck Depression Inventory, Anxiety Inventory. The MMPI, we now don't do the revised format. We now do the second edition, which is the full 567 questions, projective drawings, TAT, and the Rorschach. And what you'll see with someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, oftentimes they really want to look good. They don't want to be, they don't want to look like they have a problem. That's kind of one of their last defenses that's up. And so again, they'll be drinking and they'll be using to kind of cover up all the upsetting feelings. So you usually won't see that high of depression or anxiety on the BDI or BAI, but you will see it on the MMPI because the questions are a little bit more disguised, and then you will really see it on the Rorschach and the TAT. And so, for instance, this is just an example of a projective drawings that I have seen. The first one is if somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder, when I ask them to draw a house, a tree, and a person, it's so interesting. With PTSD, you'll get a couple usually different presentations. The usual house has ground, it has a path, it has windows. The windows have curtains, you've got a chimney, you've got a door. With PTSD, there usually won't be a door, or the door will be tiny, tiny, tiny. The house will be tiny. There may not be any windows. There won't be any ground. And it's a protective. It's to protect, they're unconsciously protecting themselves from any more violation or desecration of their body or their psyche. And in the tree, someone who's very depressed or has PTSD, if the PTSD has included sexual abuse, you'll see a tree with kind of phallic projections. I've seen this very often with both boys and girls who have been victims of sexual abuse, and with adults, who have, when they were children or when they were adults, been victims of sexual abuse. And then a regular tree is with ground, a trunk, and kind of the foliage shaded in. And then with the person, every single time, I just had someone yesterday who was the victim of actually a hate crime. And when I asked him to draw a person, he drew a stick figure. I always see stick figures drawn, not bodies, not a person with a body and a face. There will be a stick figure. There'll be no facial features. There'll often be just a face, or often there'll be no facial features at all. And it's, again, a way to protect the person from being violated or desecrated again. And it's a way they have to protect themselves. And so then we go into the thematic apperception test, and that's so interesting, the stories that you'll get with people that have had post-traumatic stress disorder. Just to give you an example, there's a famous picture, which is the picture, I couldn't show it because it's all copyrighted, but there's a picture of a woman who's very upset, and she's kind of slouched over an ottoman, and there's an object next to her that looks like it could be a gun or a knife. And she looks pretty upset and like she's crying. And so when you ask one of the people who have post-traumatic stress disorder what it looks like is going on, they'll usually, like a person who hasn't had PTSD will say, this person's very upset. But, they're going to get up, and that's their keys on the floor. They'll always see that as keys. And they'll get up, and they're going to be okay. With PTSD, it's a gun or a knife. They're going to pick it up and they're going to shoot themselves, or they've just shot themselves. And you'll see that over and over again. And with another picture, which is a picture of an adult leaning over to put their hand on the forehead of a child who's lying down on a couch, with people that have not had PTSD, the story is always going to be in the lines of it's a father or a priest or a doctor that's going to heal this person to help them, or it's a parent putting the child to bed, putting their head on the forehead. If the person is a victim of sexual or physical abuse or trauma, they will almost always say, this is somebody that's going to attack the child. They're going to kill the child. They're going to murder the child. They're going to strangle the child. They're going to abuse the child. They're going to rape the child. You'll just see that over and over again. And so you'll really see the PTSD come up on the thematic apperception test stories. And then on the Rorschach, this is my favorite of all the tests. It's one of the most famous of all the projective tests. It's been used for over 120 years. There's a standard scoring system by Exner, which now has been updated by Dr. Blatches and my colleague, Philip Erdberg. And there are 10 cards that have the same cards that have existed for 120 years. They have different designs, and the client looks at these designs and says what they see in the designs. And the scoring is very complicated. In my opinion, it takes a number of years to really get good at it. And the results include many different diagnoses, but with post-traumatic stress disorder, without going into it too much because it has so many different scoring results. But what you will see is you'll always see with PTSD what we call a low lambda, which means that the person, when asked why, like they'll see a blot and they'll say, oh, that looks like a butterfly. And you'll say, why does it look like a butterfly? And they'll say, it's just the shape. If somebody's very depressed, they'll usually just say, it's just the shape. But if somebody in the later cards that have color in them, when you ask why something looks like it, why it looks that way, they'll always mention the color, the shading, the texture. And people who are healthy mention that also. But with somebody who has PTSD, you'll see them overwhelmed and overcome by the colors, again, because color stands for emotion and affect. And they don't have a lot of defenses in place because they have been violated by the abuser. And so you will see over and over again kind of a low lambda. And you'll also see a tremendous amount of past stress, which is called D, an adjusted D. That will be a very high. And you'll also see often very high isolation index. The isolation index is made up of, people will see, in other words, a lot of botany, of trees, of landscape, and not of people. They won't see people in the blots as much. They'll see more landscape and trees. They'll be getting away from people because they're trying to distance themselves from other people, which is a very lonely thing to do. So after the testing, I write up the report, we do the feedback, and we have recommendations. And for someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's many different recommendations that we give. One of the important things to know about, we do, of course, because everyone that comes to us does have drinking or drug problem, we always recommend AA and NA, in which we start them on that here, going to meetings, which are so important to have that support. But there also are support groups for post-traumatic stress disorder survivors, and those are very important. In addition, we also recommend meditation, yoga, exercise, and diet, which we start them off on here also, good programs. And we also will recommend following up with a therapist who really is knowledgeable about post-traumatic stress disorder. And in San Francisco, there is a wonderful program at the VA that was started about 10 years ago by Victoria Beckner and Kate Gopinski. And what they do is they do 12 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy. But what they discovered about 10 years ago is that they were treating the veterans that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And about 40% of those veterans got much better after the 12 weeks, and the others didn't. And when they looked at why they got better, it turned out that the veterans that got better were on a medication to prevent tuberculosis in Iraq called dicyclosporine. And so they now use that medication and give that medication to the people that are in the study. It has not been okayed by the FDA yet, so the only place to get that medication is through this study. You can't get it privately. But the dicyclosporine is meant to prevent tuberculosis, but somehow its secondary effect turned out to be neurobiologically, that it would stop the firing of the neural networks that would be in a pattern over and over and over again, and it stops the nightmares, it stops the intrusive thinking, it stops the flashbacks. It's really something else again. And this is a medication that was meant to prevent tuberculosis. So 2 of those people that headed that program are, again, Victoria Beckner, who wrote a book called Conquering Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. That's a fantastic book that we use here. And also Kate Gopinski, and they have a private office on Union Street in the city. And so I have recommended meeting with them to some of our clients here. And then, so some of the publications that I found have been very helpful have been this Conquering Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder by Victoria Beckner. Then the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder workbook that I've used. We have a curriculum here. We have classes that we have at 9 o'clock and 1 o'clock, 9:15 and 1:15 every day. And I had taught classes on post-traumatic stress disorder, and we have classes on PTSD here. And the PTSD workbook is very helpful. I Love a Man in Uniform by Lily Barana is actually a very interesting book. She ended up marrying a major in the Army, and he had tremendous PTSD. She didn't discover it until about a year into the marriage, and it almost destroyed the marriage. And so they went through this kind of EMDR treatment, and that was really helpful. So she describes how that helped. And then Shaded Black by Jessica Goodell. She was a Marine that was in Iraq, and she was on what they call mortuary duty, where she had to pick up pieces of people that had been blown to bits and put them back together, and then send them home to the parents, and had to call the parents and tell them. I mean, I can't think of a more horrific job in the world. And so she did that for about a year, and every single person on the mortuary duty ended up having severe PTSD. And she wrote a book about it. Then Healing from Trauma, A Survivor's Guide to Understanding Your Symptoms and Reclaiming Your Life. And then A Mind Frozen in Time is a great PTSD recovery guide. And The War at Home, One Family's Fight Against PTSD. A lot of these books were originally, part of them are kind of dedicated to veterans, but many of these books are also for people that have suffered all other kinds of abuse, sexual abuse and physical abuse, things that have nothing to do with combat. So in other words, so that is kind of the description of how we do the testing here, and how we look through the testing to see if someone has post-traumatic stress disorder, and the kinds of post-traumatic stress disorder cases that we have seen. And again, there will be people such as the woman that I saw here who, although she did have childhood abuse, and I think that was an important part of her makeup, there was also this tremendous success that I think clicked off the drinking and the using. And so those things are important to look for. And we do get, other clients in that have had really bad abuse histories. And they'll come in and they'll have been using in order to not think about the abuse, to kind of push it down into the unconscious. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks.
The last slide, the book, is that available? Can I get that?
Oh, yes.
How do I do it?
You can just talk to me right afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We put it back on the screen and we can take a picture of the phone.
Yeah, that's a good idea too.
Wow.
But these are all really great books, and I have read all of these. Those are really excellent. Anyway, yes.
Don't recall the name of it, but it used to called Hero. It was a movie about a person who survived a plane crash with near-in-town pain. I work with film a lot in my work. And he felt himself invulnerable. He's walking on the edges of buildings and things. It was a beautiful description, visual and emotional, of someone who lost touch with reality, feeling invulnerable. I think it's called Hero. Is that right? something of that sort.
And I love that you said that, because that is what you see happen sometimes with the bad traumas, but you really do see it happen with these good traumas after somebody has had this tremendous success or has survived something that other people have not survived. And, they call it also survivor's guilt, but there's something underneath that. That's a bit superficial for my liking. And, just to blanket statement, survivor's guilt, there's something else underneath that. And then you do get these fascinating cases where people feel invulnerable, and it's so amazing. And it's like, whoa, and there's this real disconnect with the reality testing that is so interesting. And again, if you have a chance, do watch that movie called Man on Wire, because it's one of the best portrayals I've ever seen of somebody losing reality testing after a tremendous success. I mean, it is crystal clear that is why this happened. There's no other reason. He had no other abuse in his background whatsoever.
Does the movie portray the afterwards?
Yes. Yes. It actually does. It actually shows him.
I blocked that part out.
Yeah.
There you go.
I remember all of the planning and,
Yeah.
secrecy.
You will see at the end, him go into the crowd and grab a girl that he doesn't know and disappear, and you'll see that they talk about that he dumped the woman that he'd been with his whole life, that he was going to marry. And then it was either a shot in the movie or it was like one of those things that reads up that he later, you do see him in Paris in a tiny little walk-up flat on the top floor with no elevator, just the stairs with a little hot plate with a little sterno. It's really tragic. He's completely gone bonkers. Yes?
Think about people recovering from alcoholism. You hear this all the time, that they're doing fine, everything's great, they get a promotion at work, and then they go out and drink.
Exactly. That is exactly what happens. Yep. And that's why it is so important. My dad is a psychoanalyst. His name is Doctor Weiss, and he wrote several papers about this phenomena because he saw that with his patients over and over again, and he's been doing analysis for over 55 years now. He's like 84, and so he couldn't figure it out. It didn't make any sense. And I think one of the most fascinating stories I remember about, when he was talking was, this wasn't one of his patients, but another person that he had heard about. This person had got a tremendous promotion at work, and they left the office, and they were on the top floor, and they went to the elevator, and the guy pushed the button to go up, but there is no up. It was on the top floor. And he raced back into the office. He was horrified and terrified. And it turned out, he said, I thought I was going up to heaven. He had lost reality testing completely, and it was terrifying. And that is what is so frightening. And then people, to stop that feeling, will go and drink or use again.
Because it's kind of like relapse prevention. Almost.
Right.
How do you prepare someone for the fact that when their life's been doing really well, and you stop drinking, that you're getting close to, you could be getting close to a relapse?
That's exactly why you send them to a therapist who knows about this kind of thing and is aware of this kind of thing and can warn them. Or that when they come in and say, I just had a promotion at work, you say, I want to tell you something. That's great, and you might be fine with that. But just so that you know, if you start to feel a little high, be aware and come and tell me about it, and let's talk about it.
It's like, oh my God, I'm so excited, I don't need to drink anymore. And if there's that altered sense, we call it like within the cloud, you're not in reality. And it's like, when they're newly sober, that they're going to have to come down off that particular high.
Right, exactly. And so it's really a good thing to be aware of when we work in substance abuse, because what people will generally do is do something very self-defeating or self-destructive to get rid of that success. And with addicts, they will go to the chosen substance, and they will use drugs or they'll use alcohol. Right, exactly. Or get in the car and drive 1,000,000 miles an hour. Yes?
Does the treatment for the good trauma differ from the, say, horrific traumatic PTSD?
Excellent question. Actually, it's a little bit different because with the good trauma, you don't have that kind of standard PTSD. You don't really have flashbacks or nightmares. I mean, you can, but not nearly to the same degree as the serious, the bad trauma. The treatment with the good trauma is much more kind of talking about and making aware, making conscious what has been unconscious, making the person aware that to have such a success can lead you to a loss of reality testing and what that feels like. It's more like educational almost, because usually the symptoms won't be flashbacks, intrusive thoughts and all that. The symptoms will be doing something very self-destructive and crazy to stop the success, to get back to reality, because the loss of the reality testing is so terrifying.
What's the correlation between, in the good trauma, quote unquote, with people having inconsistent belief structures around success, like I'm not worthy or I'm stupid and I have this success, it doesn't match, therefore I don't know what to do with it. What's the correlation with that?
With people who have those kind of belief structures, they are much more likely to have this kind of reaction because they don't feel worthy, and it doesn't match, and so cognitively it's like this cognitive dissonance, and it feels weird, and so on top of the almost physiological reaction, because if you think about having a baby or falling in love, there's that kind of physiological reaction to that, which you feel high, you really do, and then there's this moment where you really do feel unreal. I mean, I think everybody's experienced that. If you team that with having a previously standing cognitive belief that you don't deserve this or that you're not worthy, then it just makes it worse. Yes?
I wonder, you use the formulations in control mastery where they work very, very strongly with this, what's called survivor guilt in a different sense than just literal way, but you don't deserve it. I feel lonely because I've lost contact with my family, because I'm successful. All of those formulations seem like they could be quite relevant, not to the extent where you're dealing with someone who's lost touch with reality, but underneath that feeling of loneliness and I'm not good enough.
And that is very interesting because the person who invented control mastery was Doctor Weiss, who is my second dad, who my best friend Beth, that's Beth, Martha, and John's father, who I grew up with, and I spent every summer from age 15 to 25 in Malibu in their summer home with them while he wrote that book with Hal Sampson. And so I know that book and the theory inside and out, probably better than anyone, and except for them. And so that theory goes to a certain point and not beyond. And my dad and Joe used to have tremendous arguments about this all the time. And they stopped speaking to each other for a while. We used to have Chinese dinner every Sunday night all together, and that stopped for a few years. Then they got to be friends again. But control mastery takes it to a certain point and not beyond. So my dad had always felt that it wasn't quite, it did not quite go all the way that it should have in this particular area. It's very, very useful for many other areas. And it starts to get there but doesn't finish. Oh, one final question? Yes.
I'm thinking about the recent brain research about the different neural pathways, the egocentric one at the top and then the temporal one for the more allocentric. And relating that to what you're saying, I wonder if you think that that this after successes, especially traumas, that there's what we used to call spiritual emergency, where people get stuck in that place where they're losing that that top kind of, is that where we're going?
Yeah, definitely. I do think it is absolutely neurophysiological. And there is this, they do kind of get stuck in this area of the brain where it feels like this kind of, emergency, and you feel in this altered state. And you lose the daily feeling that you have of reality, and you really lose that reality testing, and you get stuck in this other area. And it's very frightening. And so people will do whatever they need to do to stop that feeling. And with addicts, that absolutely means relapsing. And so you'll just see it over and over again. And because at Alta Mira, and I'm sure many of your practices, we have very successful clients. That's why it's good to be extra aware of this kind of thing, because we do see people that are like very successful people. And so it's good to be aware of the successes as well as the traumas. I mean, the obvious traumas. So the good and the bad trauma. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for coming.